Excellent. Well, welcome everybody. Tonight we're going to look at interfaith spirituality. So it's the sort of spirituality that emerges from an engagement of people of other faiths. That's basically what we're playing at here. So faiths other than our own. Now, on previous evenings, what we've done is look very carefully at ecumenical Christian spiritualities from an Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Protestant, sectarian sort of point of view. So here's a few of those spiritualities that we've already looked at from within the Christian tradition. I've tried to put slides together, this was Joris's idea, so that we can see the contrast of the spiritualities that we've looked at. You can probably now guess what sort of spirituality all of this is about. On the right, you've got a Coptic spirituality. On the left, a Western Latin sort of spirituality. Here is this. Now, let's see if we can guess. Is it Reims?
Chartres.
Is it Chartres? Ah, it's Chartres. Yes. Yes. Oh, I should have known that from the statues right there. Here we have two contrasting spiritualities, a spirituality of Mary in Guadeloupe, and on the right-hand side...
It's a Danish Lutheran minister.
That's why it's got that beautiful collar.
Yes.
A Danish Lutheran minister on the right. And here we have...
You have the little church in the woods.
Yes.
There's a hymn about that.
Yeah. Is it a Presbyterian church, maybe?
I don't know. I just
Congregationalist church,
yeah,
perhaps?
Quite congregationalist.
Yeah. And on the right...
It's supposed to be an evangelical church in Gabon, I think.
In Gabon?
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure that the people in this church would find this very strange, and the people in this church would find that rather boring.
Now it's a hermit. I don't know where he is actually. And on the other hand, you have a beautiful Ethiopian Madonna. A very American evangelical
Yes,
depiction
that's
of Jesus.
right. Depiction of Jesus as the Good Shepherd.
Yes.
So all of these images we have looked at come from all sorts of different Christian spiritualities.
Yes.
Now,
yes. So for some of us, what we've already done, and looking at these different trends inside Christian spirituality, mostly we've only touched Christian spirituality and like different branches of Christian tradition. It can be quite already quite a work of interfaith dialogue. You know, like if you come from a very Protestant background, you might feel a bit uncomfortable when we did the spirituality course on Marian spirituality, for instance. So it's not so far from an interfaith dialogue, actually, within the Christian world, let's say. But now it's time to look at other forms of encounters, which have been as present as the other one we've looked at. That is encounters with Muslims, with Jews, and we'll discuss this question, Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, and people from any confessional faith, which is different than what you claim and what we claim or what the Episcopal Church claims, if there is a corporate understanding of spirituality, I don't know, to be our own or my own. So that's what we're going to look at tonight, and we're going to look at it from a historical perspective and spiritual perspective. So here you have different slides, and you're going to be able to figure out what faith. That's really a broad depiction, of course, because all this faith tradition have as much diversity as we have seen when we're studying Christianity. So you see, like, from Protestant evangelicalism to Ethiopian Orthodox, it's quite a stretch, and here it's quite a very bird view of these different faith traditions. So here, it's...
That must be Islam.
That must be Islam.
Mm-hmm.
So women praying.
Here. That's Hasidic Judaism.
Ascetic Judaism, yes. I don't know what they're holding, but protesting for something. Here.
This must be Hinduism, yeah, with all of these wonderful offerings on either side.
Yeah, beautiful.
Hindu
Festival,
pilgrimage.
festival of pilgrimage.
Yeah.
Here.
And here we have Sikhs.
6.
And women in the front and the men behind there.
Yeah.
And is it? I wonder where this is taking place.
That's a
It's
good
a
question.
beautiful image there.
Yeah.
We'll be looking a bit more at the imagery of this picture a little bit later on when we discuss Sikh prayers.
I purposely chose pictures of persons because I think it's really grounding to see faces of people engaged in their worship or devotional practices and their faith. Here, some
Yes, some Buddhist children.
Yeah, Buddhist monks, young monks.
Young monks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now, that's a bit more tricky.
It's a bit more tricky. I think this must be the Episcopal Church at Prayer in the woods. But it looks like they bought their gear from some very strange store.
Some druidic. So it's a neo-pagan group. So I think it's probably close to Wicca. And
A Wiccan group?
I'm not privy yet. I'm going to take a class next semester about magic, so I may learn more about that. But here you are. So other forms of Western spirituality, modern contemporary spirituality.
Ah, yes. That was a good choice to include. Atheists are people too, and we vote. As we saw a couple of weeks ago when we did media spirituality and sectarian spiritualities. Spirituality isn't reserved just to the mainstream Christian or other forms of religious observance that we think of as mainstream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's a form. Atheism is also a form of belief, and this is quite different from atheism too. You see, like there's so much diversity also amongst this.
What's this one of?
This one is a voodoo ceremony in Haiti.
In Haiti?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Here we are. So you see music, and the different pictures we could like you don't hear the noise, you don't hear this, you don't feel the smell and things, but that's also so much part of this diversity. How people are involved differently with their bodies, as we saw with the little reading we had tonight. If you followed our evening prayer, which was talking about the importance of the body postures in worship and engaging it in an interfaith way, but you can see it in all the pictures we've just seen too. Now,
yes. Let's start where many of us might find ourselves when we're approaching the question what an interfaith spirituality is about. Traditionally speaking, the Christian world has approached the spirituality of other religions in one of 3 ways, and here they are on the screen: exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism. These 3 approaches are not specific to a denomination. So you won't actually find that exclusivism is more of a, Protestant thing, and pluralism is more of an Episcopalian thing. You will find exclusivists, inclusivists, pluralists in every single one of the Christian denominations that you might come across, and in other places too, actually, secular situations as well. So all denominations of Christianity contain people who hold these positions. Let's look first at exclusivism. Exclusivists operate on these following ideas. First of all, there is one truth. Truth is singular. It's one. It's not many. You can't have many truths. There's only one truth. Secondly, Christian exclusivists say that all of us are fallen creatures. Humanity is fallen, and we're incapable of saving ourselves. Therefore, because we are fallen and incapable of saving ourselves, we need salvation from outside ourselves. We need God's intervention to save us. Here, Jesus said, he is the way, the truth, and the life. John 14:8, if you've been to Pathfinder camp or Navigators or something, or brought up in a Christian denomination where these things were done, you would have learned this verse probably by heart. Only one road leads to heaven. The intervention to rescue us came uniquely through Christ. Christ was God's only Son, and only true belief, only true salvation is found in Jesus.
That's usually also a very individualistic understanding of Christ as an individual, as an image of one person, historical Christ. Usually.
So mission. Convert. That's your only option when you encounter the different, as we will see in a minute. Salvation has happened uniquely through Christ. The Bible is going to tell us the story of the truth of that intervention. Uniquely, the Bible reveals the fact that there is one truth. We are in need of salvation from outside, and God's intervention is recorded in the Bible in the story of the trial, death, and resurrection of Christ. Next, you can have a personal experience of that commitment to Christ, and that's how you receive salvation from outside. You get, essentially, your own personal Jesus who saves you. There's no salvation outside that revelation. It belongs uniquely to Christ, revealed in the Bible. There is no salvation outside the redeeming work of Christ. This is why it's called the exclusivist position. So what's that going to mean when you engage spiritually with somebody of a different religion from your own? First of all, you will tend to believe that Christianity contains all the truth you could possibly need. There's no need really to engage with any other religion, because your own religion, the true one, has got everything you could possibly need. In any case, they would say, Christianity isn't really a religion at all. These other things are religions. Religions are invented by human beings. But the truth is revealed in Christ. Christianity isn't a religion, it's the truth. So that means the only way you can really engage with other religions is to convert those people to the real truth of Christ. Outside their man-made religion, Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism, whatever ism you care to mention, you're going to convert them from a human ism to the truth of Jesus. He exclusively holds that truth. The other thing that might happen is that you're going to regard other religions in the same way as you regard your own. They're monolithic, they're solid, they're self-contained worlds of belief and practice. They're free of nuance, they have no openness, they have no ambiguity to them. They're monolithic systems. The Jews believe that. The Hindus believe that. The Muslims believe that. Can you see what we're doing to these other religions? We're turning them into a two-dimensional thing. But we're going to say we are the only true three-dimensional religion while remaining in our own two-dimensional exclusivist world. So you're going to consider other religions rather like you consider your own exclusive religion. If you're an extremist exclusivist, you will probably think that other religions are inspired by demons. Where does Hinduism come from? They worship demons. Is Allah the same God as the God of the Bible? No, say the exclusivists. The Muslims worship a different God. Can't be the same one. So you see that if you're an extremist exclusivist that believes Jesus is the only way, Any other religion can't come from God. It has to come from somewhere else. And maybe it's these demons that they're worshipping. They're idol worshippers, demon worshippers. They're inimical to the gospel. They deny its power to save. Now, if you're a sort of moderate, there you go. The Quranic Jesus, a demonic deception. This is a classic work of the exclusivist mind. An evangelical assessment of Jesus in the Quran. Yeah. Now, if you're a sort of moderate exclusivist, you might think there are certain things about these other religions. For example, the golden rule, see here, do as you would be done by, love your neighbor as yourself. This is expressed in all of the religions, really, from Jainism to Sikhism to the Baha'is to native spiritualities. You might say, now, look, they've got this thing in their scriptures. Let's use it to evangelize them. Because this is a human invention, not a godly one. But we can really reveal to them the truth of the exclusive claim of Christ, even though they've got something nice in their religion that has been invented by human beings. We can use that in order to convert them to the true faith. I hope that makes sense. Let's move on to inclusivists for a little minute. An inclusivist is going to believe the following things. Just like an exclusivist, don't get me wrong, an inclusivist does not believe that Christianity is the same as other religions. Not at all. An inclusivist is going to say, salvation comes through Christ alone. Just like an exclusivist is going to say, salvation only in Jesus. Salvation of all human beings has been made available through the death and resurrection of God's Son. That's how it works. God's Son came down, took on the sin of the world, and redeemed us. The Son's work is to bring all of the people into this saving embrace. That story is told most clearly, most unambiguously in the Bible, because the Bible is the locus of the truth of God's saving grace in Christ. Secondly, not only will you believe that salvation comes through Christ alone, like the exclusivist, unlike the exclusivist, you're going to say, but God wants the whole world to be saved. See the difference? He doesn't want anybody to be condemned because of a principle. And that applies especially in the case of those people who've never even heard the name of Jesus. Will God say, well, because you haven't heard the name of Jesus, you're going to be sent to hell? No, says an inclusivist. What sort of God would condemn you just because of that? So what does this inclusivist position mean when it comes to engaging spiritually with other religions? Well, if God doesn't want to condemn everybody who hasn't heard the name of Jesus, God must have made it possible somehow to be saved by some other means. So you've never heard the name of Jesus. How are you going to be saved? Well, it must be because Christ is acting anonymously in these other religions. God is reaching out in Christ in disguise in Islam, in disguise in Hinduism. Christ is still doing the saving, but he's disguised in these other religions. It's the anonymous Christ working through Hinduism. Jesus saves them by breathing mysteriously somehow through their own cultures, through their own beliefs. Joyce, can you tell us a little bit about these slides?
Yeah. So these slides are interesting. They're showing something which has existed in the Christian tradition, a way of trying to comprehend the pre-Christian tradition and trying to see them in an inclusivist
Yes.
way. So here you see Christ on the right. You can see Christ at the moment of his death, just after his death, going down to hell to rescue the pagans, not only the prophets, but also the pagan authors. So Aristotle, Plato, according to these teachings and according to this devotion and views about the working of Christ, the salvation through Christ, he was able, because of his death, to also redeem people who came before him and people outside of the Christian, who didn't hear about him because they were in a different culture, like the Greek philosophers. Another example of that is the Sibylla. You can see, so the Sibylla was, there were many Sibyllas, and they were women who were prophetess, but they were not Hebrew prophetess or Christian prophetesses. They were pagan or polytheist soothsayers, and they would actually, like their sayings were collected, and these collections were later read as a prefiguration of the coming of Christ. So they've also been included in this very inclusivist conception of interfaith dialogue, you see.
Now, an inclusivist would probably say, well, yes, Jesus can save people anonymously through other religions. We still have to rely on Jesus' death and resurrection to reconcile us to God. But, really, it would be better if they were Christians. Christ, after all, is the clearest, the truest statement of God's work of salvation. It's Christ, after all, who's made salvation through other religions possible. So it's rather sad that the Hindus don't recognize Christ for Christ, but nevertheless, Christ is working anonymously through Hinduism to save them, so long as they're good Hindus. And if they're good Muslims, Christ can work anonymously through Islam as well. So even if they don't become Christians, which would be a nicer option, at least Jesus is able to make the best of a bad job and save them anonymously through the practice of their own religion. Now, you might say, well, when we encounter these other religions as an inclusivist, it might be interesting to discover what they believe. It's very intriguing to see what Hindus believe. It might be intriguing to see how Christ might be anonymously present in Sikhism or in the Baha'i faith. But it isn't strictly necessary. You don't really need to know about it. So missionary work, the encounter with another religion, is going to be more like exploring than it is going to be about telling other people about your experience of the redeeming work of Christ. You'll go to other religions as a tourist, rather than somebody who wants to say, if you ate proper food and cleaned your houses properly, like the English people do, you could be saved. But as it is, that'll probably do. And it was interesting visiting you. Thank you very much. I'll take my slides home and enjoy them with my neighbours. So that's more of a sort of approach of an inclusivist when it comes to exploring other religions. Also, it might be tempting at times to say to these adherents of other religions, you're a Hindu, I know that's interesting, but let me tell you, we have that in the Bible as well. Let me tell you how Jesus says that better, because he's the one that's procured salvation for you. Oh yes, you have the golden rule, that's interesting, but Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that we must treat other people like we would want to be treated ourselves. Even the Pharisees treat their enemies in this way. But I say to you, do good to those who persecute you, love those who hate you. And suddenly you become rather patronizing about these other religions because you think that Jesus is active through them, and you want to tell them exactly how that works. It's a bit of a colonialist position.
Yeah, it's different.
Yeah. You'll be told, if you're a Hindu or a Sikh or a Muslim or something, this is what you need to know about Jesus. because we can see he's been anonymous in your religion, and now we're introducing him to you properly. I don't want to be too unpleasant about it, because it's not quite as radical as an exclusivist position that would just go in there and say, listen, your Vishnu is the demon, and you've got to abandon it right now and get Jesus as your saviour. As an inclusivist, you'll say, Vishnu had some nice things to say about ladies. Jesus did that too with the Samaritan woman at the well. Let me tell you how you might be able to be saved through Vishnu's lady's vision, or something.
It's always reducing in the end someone else's experience to your own.
Yes.
So that's the problem.
That's
with
it.
This vision.
Yeah.
It's like actually not listening to anybody.
Yeah.
To the difference and to Christ speaking in these other people.
Yes. Yes. You never really hear them as other. You only hear them as a facet of what's going on in your own head.
And as you said, Nigel, it's usually also the attitude you have to your own religion when you live through with this attitude towards others. So I think also the attitude, the way you would read the text in the Bibles, for instance, would be also in this way of trying to read in your theology, read in your understanding of Christ in the Bible. Or, I mean, it's a very difficult job to do, to be deeply listening.
It is.
But that's an interesting challenge.
Yeah. And it's a challenge in all things, isn't it? Because I think some people listen in order to invent a reply in their own heads. They're not actually listening. They're just using the occasion to think of what they're going to say next. And very often this inclusivist position runs into that temptation. Let's look at the third one. That's pluralism. Pluralists, unlike inclusivists and exclusivists, are going to believe the following things. Truth is not one, like the exclusivists think. Truth is multifaceted. It is very many. There are many different truths expressed in many different ways, in many different times, and in many different places. That's why it's called pluralism. It's a very pluralistic way of looking at the world. They're also going to tell you that all religions lead to God, without exception. This slide here is a slide of the planets, and it is up there to represent this major shift in religious thinking. At one point, Christians believed that Christianity was at the center of the universe of religions. Other religions were close to Christianity or far away from it. You know, Islam and Judaism perhaps were a bit like Mars and Venus, but when you get to things like Hinduism, they're a long way out there and they're far away from the central gravity of Christianity, like Hinduism or, I don't know, the Baha'i faith or Zoroastrianism. But what pluralists believe is that God is at the center of this universe and all religions revolve around God. We're all on the same track. So God has been placed at the center and all religions are like planets that revolve around God. So we used to think that our religion was the true one, other religions were close to it or they were further away from it, but now we see that God is the center and all religions are orbiting the same God. Another way of putting it, which you might have heard of, is that there are many roads up the mountain. The top of the mountain here, which we can't see because it's over here, let's pretend this mountain is God. The top of the mountain is God, and we're all following our own paths up to the top of it. Sometimes we won't be able to see each other, but sometimes we may be able to catch a glimpse over the brink of the hill. But we're all actually headed in the same direction. All religions are equal because they're all climbing the same mountain. So what is this going to mean when it comes to engaging spiritually with people of other faiths? What effect is this going to have on your approach, say, to Islam or Hinduism or Zoroastrianism or Sikhism? Well, you might say, first of all, why bother with missionary work or engagement with other religions if we have no truth to proclaim to them that they don't already have for themselves? No point, really. It would be like people trying to persuade you to change laundry detergent. They all get your clothes clean, so why should it be of interest to me if you use Tide or Fairy soap? It all does the same. It all does the same thing after all. So if one truth is as good as another truth, for the purposes of salvation at least, we should just let everybody do their own thing. We could afford to be indifferent to other religions. It really doesn't matter what you believe. Oh, I think that, I don't know, Kali, the great destructor, will bring an end to the current age of the world. You think, oh, well, so what? We think it's Jesus, and it's all the same thing, really. That's interesting enough.
Yeah, and it's also posing like big moral questions, like some religion practices like human sacrifice. Does it fit in? Like
Yes.
how do you relate to these deep questions, or between the preservation of someone's worldview and your own moral
standpoint?
Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly right. See, here it is. Here's the person's mind, and there, floating in the background, what can we see?
Jesus.
We can see a Jesus, we can see Buddha, we can see
Video game mushroom.
a video game mushroom person. It really doesn't matter what you believe in. It's all fine. They're all roads up the same mountain. Also, it makes it possible, and this is a strange point. You can plunder each religion to get at the best bits. So there might be certain things that you like about Judaism or about Hinduism, and other things that you don't like. So I'm going to say, it's like going to what's that store over here on the corner of Lexington Avenue and 60th Street? It's a store where they sell sweets. They sell not cookies, candies. They're all the same price. You wander in there and you've got sugar snakes, sugar shrimps, M&Ms, all sorts of cute little things, and you can just sort of pick and mix if you like. Find the bits that you want and leave the rest behind. I think we had a slide of that, didn't we? We might see that in a second. But listen, if somebody was coming to Christianity as a Baha'i, they might say, oh, I love the Sermon on the Mount, but I really don't like this Jesus business bringing a sword to divide families. And I don't like that verse where he says divorce is not permitted, or is teaching, or Paul's teaching on women. So I'm going to leave that bit out and just choose the bits that I like. So for me, say, for instance, if I encountered Sikhism for the first time, and I suddenly discover that one of the central tenets of Sikhism is the community meal, to which everybody is invited into the langar after they've been to the Gurdwara for the readings from the Adi Granth, from the sacred book of Sikhism. Everybody is invited, rich, poor alike, and they all sit on the floor and take it in turns to serve. And they eat together. It's a fundamental tenet of Sikhism. You can bring a little pot of rice if you want, or nothing at all. It won't matter. You'll still be invited to sit down and eat. But then you discover that the main symbols of Sikhism on the right there are swords, straight swords and scimitars. And there's a sort of militaristic streak in Sikhism. Understandable, if you like, because they're caught between Hinduism and Islam, and they had to fight a lot to keep their own space. So these symbols, if I might encounter for the first time, and all I'd done was gone to a langar, I would say, oh, I like that bit, but I don't want that bit, thank you very much. And it means that I don't get the full picture. I've picked and I've chosen, and that means I'm not doing justice to the interfaith spirituality that I'm being called to encounter. So pluralism lets you off the hook with that. If we're all going up the same mountain anyway, why not pick and choose? Why not choose the things you like in Christianity or anything else and make your own little fun mix?
What I find interesting about these different trends, Nigel, you're describing to us, like the exclusivist or the inclusivist or the pluralistic one, is that they all assume, especially the pluralistic one, like a subject which is a person who is able to judge as a kind of exterior to the question and choose things. So like as if there's a neutral subject, a neutral person that's choosing and picking things. So it's really depending on the very secular society and worldview in the first place, even if it's talking and doing with something with religion.
Yes, it's a sort of like a capitalist system of choosing what you fancy as a consumer, and seeing these religions as objects to be consumed, rather than things to belong to live in, to run a risk in, if you like. Now, you might not like any of these positions when they're taken in isolation, and it's certainly true that we move from one to another. You might be exclusivist in some ways, inclusivist in others, pluralist in other positions. And so when we encounter other people of other religions, you might encounter a really friendly Muslim. And you might say, oh, I think I'm a pluralist after all. Then the next day you might encounter a fundamental Hindu that believes in Modi and his one nation Indian Hindu endeavor, expunging everybody else, and you'll think, oh gosh, that's dreadful. Hinduism must be awful if that's what it's all about. So we move between these positions, and depending on what's happening in the world and what our encounters with others are like. Now, the Bible, you might say, what does the Bible say? Is it exclusivist? Is it inclusivist? Is it pluralist? Well, actually, it hovers between all of these positions. And in the end, what we're going to see in a second is that the Bible is a very interfaith book itself. I'm going to let Joris swap seats with me for a sec.
Yeah, what I found very interesting what you were saying, Nigel, is that all these attitudes, exclusivist, inclusivist, pluralistic, are very heady attitudes. And the exclusivist has a very boxed understanding of Jesus as this individual, and then you have one which is an understanding of Jesus as a principle, which is the inclusivist one, and then the pluralist is also like a form of capitalist understanding of this. So all of these attitudes toward different faith traditions are very heady ones, I find, and not really involved with the incarnal encounter with other and the listening to each other in this deep way. So now we're going to look at the Bible, as Nigel said, and we're going to look at it from the different lenses that Nigel describes. So if you're an exclusivist, for instance, you will believe that God speaks uniquely to the Hebrew people in a religious vacuum. So you think there is the elect people, and then all around it there is the pagans, basically, or the nations. If you project yourself, your exclusivist vision into your reading of the Bible.
God spoke only to the chosen people.
Yes.
He wasn't speaking to anybody else.
Yeah. So in this vision, you read in this exclusivist attitude, and you think that what is in the Bible, for instance, is untouched by the surrounding cultures. So it's totally out of the ground. It's coming, celestial Jerusalem coming down from heaven. But it is a very modern attitude of reading it. It's a very prejudiced form of reading it. Because it's understanding what the Bible and the text in the Bible are doing in a modern historical way. And that's understanding in the modern historical statement what was first a spiritual, political, theological community national one. So it's a way more complex question than actually projecting your exclusivist vision to it. It's more like the work that you find in a community when you have a lot of different people and voices inside the very same community. It doesn't come first through the head. It comes first through the life, the embodied life of a community. So usually we reduce, for instance, the idea of Israel as the chosen people, as being the one of historical truth. But this idea of the chosen people, as we shape it as modern people, as something historical, like this elected people throughout history, it's a prejudice, because it's an ideologic. It was shaped and into the text itself as an ideological one, which served a very deep purpose and try to describe in theological, spiritual ways the way humans interact with God. But it's not so much of an historical one. It's a very spiritual and communal experience of God and election. But we want to understand it with our exclusivist mind as something historical. So if you want a comparison to make it clearer, it would be like believing so much in the American myth of a Christian nation, for instance, that you wouldn't pay any attention and you would deny any importance and importance of anything that other faith traditions have brought to America in the shaping of the American nationhood. So, for instance, it would be saying that American Jews and other faith traditions, which have built American society, history, and identity, are outsiders, total outsiders. So it's kind of understanding, it's like you have your own idea of what your faith tradition or your nation is, and then you try to fit everything into your idea. So it's a very ungrounded way of reading the Bible. And that's actually, as we are going to say now, a very inappropriate way, because it's not listening to what it is telling you. So in short, this exclusivist attitude assumes an homogeneic and essentialist conception of religion. That is really a gross misconception of the reality of the field, of the book, of the complexity of it. And Nigel is going to talk more about how archaeological sources, and this book of Thomas Römer, who is a professor of biblical Hebrew Bible at the Collège de France, is a very good one, because it really shows how, if you look at archaeological sources, if you study carefully the history of the text and how you can compare them with other early ancient Near East texts, you can see that all this corpus, all the Bible, has been constructed and assembled through a lot of tensions. It's more a text that's encapsulating tensions of society through ages than actually one statement about what it is. So it's more like a whole society, if you want. There are pull and triggers that's actually living in the text itself.
When we did this Bible study, when we were looking at the books of the Bible, one of the things that I kept on mentioning was the position, a geographical place in which the Bible came to be. And it was the great land bridge between all of these cultures. Had Israel not been where Israel was, the Bible would never have been written. It was the crossroads of Egypt, of Babylon, of Assyria, of Crete, of Cyprus, of India, of Africa. And this crossroads of cultures produced an interfaith document that encountered all of these cultures around it and integrated, lived those cultures, worked through those cultures, didn't see them as something outside, but something that was very implicit in the way of that they understood God.
When we come to all this like pre-modern religion, that is religion that happened before the modern period, which is the 16th, 17th century, we always come to them with our prejudices about homogeneity, that there are certain holes like confessions. And we have this prejudice also of religion being different confessions, which is a very Western idea. and that it was also brought to other faith tradition like Hinduism. Hinduism didn't really exist before the arrival of the British in India, because it was not sought as a whole and a thing that's putting everything together. It was more a set of practices, and people didn't think of themselves in this way. So yes, next slide. So this is a good example. Thomas Römer talks a lot about that, and he's really interested in this study. This statue shows how if you read the text and have a certain assumption about the text, you may actually think, oh, this couldn't exist. But archaeological sources show that, like, for instance, this is a statue of El. So El is Elohim, is the god of the Hebrew. And if you read some passages in the Bible, you will see that, oh, like they never made statue, or they destroyed all the statues. So you realize that the story is way more complex than that. And that this, the definition of religious identities that we have were more fluid and complex before this modern move that I described. So the Hebrew Bible suggests, for instance, that the making of images of God is altogether forbidden. And the modern reader think, because it's in the Bible, it's an actual historical fact and truth. But what you see also in all these texts is that when they're actually talking about something which is forbidden, it's because it was being done. So it's the same with Paul, it's the same with other texts in Leviticus. When they're actually mentioning something, it's because the author has a very specific agenda and wants to argue something. And then it's all integrated in a corpus that usually keeps tension together. Like if you look at, for instance, the character of David, who is described in very different ways in Chronicles and in Kings. Yes, so it can be a very polemical question, you see, and these polemics are held together in the corpus itself. So you have different point of views on the same question, on the same issues, and they're managed to be kept together, whereas our modern viewpoint would be more to divide and say, like, these are two different groups, and then oppose, like, pagans and the Hebrews. And the Hebrews, yes. And the Hebrews who are perfect, like good Protestants without images. That's really like, we're reading in Protestant ideals, modern ideals into the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. That's really which has been done, and that has been done at a lot of different levels. We're just looking at one example of it. So the exclusivist attitude usually comes from a lack of attention to the complexity of the religious landscapes, and assumes that in the end, what the Bible says is pure truth in a very secular, historical way. And I think it's the very important way, the very important thing to mention, is that this attitude of thinking or reading the Bible, like taking a verse off and saying this is the truth, is a very secular attitude to it, and a very modern one, because it's assuming that the text can be used as a proof, just as you use proof in scientific experiments. And that's not what the text has been doing. And that's not how it has been written. So it's a very prejudiced way of reading it, and a very modern and very secular way of reading it. So the people who think usually they're most religious because they quote a Bible verse and say, this is the truth, is actually a very, if you study why they have come and why the congregation or the group or like the way they're reading is such, you realize that it comes through the process of secularization and modernization. So this is a gross misunderstanding of what the Bible is as a collection of texts that gather together conflictual points of views on religious question of identities, because that's what is at stake, like what is belonging together if we have different religious practices, what is belonging together if we have different religious texts. And the Bible is trying more or less successfully to hold them together. But sometimes it's working very well, sometimes it's not. But in the overhaul, you can create connection. It's all about connection and creating connection between things that may seem different. So here is a very interesting word cloud, which is giving you the most important words in the Bible. So that's quite interesting, because it's statistics. So statistics are actually a very modern lens at the text, and the text itself is doing a lot of different things with these words, you see. Israel may have different meanings, or like the house of the Lord. What's the house of the Lord when the temple is destroyed, you see? So these words are, they give this word cloud gives you the impression, oh, that's the same words everywhere, and there's one definition for them. But the trick is that there are a lot of definitions, and the definition changes according to different times and people who are using them, and texts and languages too, because there are more than one language used in the Bible, be it Greek, Hebrew, or Aramaic. So it is important to realize that this is a more complex story than we usually understand.
So what if you're an inclusivist, the exclusivists, as Joris was just describing, will say that the Hebrews were the Hebrews and they had the truth and everybody else around didn't. God only revealed himself to the Hebrews. All the rest of them were demons or pagans, and God wasn't really there.
So as Nigel said, with the inclusivists, you will be a bit more paternalistic with the others, a bit patronizing, so you will believe that the Hebrews followed the voice of God very clearly when it was heard only in a cloud or a certain way by the adherent of the surrounding pagan words. So if you're that's a very interesting thing, because if you actually start to pay attention to the images that's used in the Hebrew Bible, for instance, you realize that this image of a cloud and God not being totally perceivable is very present in the Bible. God doesn't show himself all the time. He doesn't show himself in face to face, so Moses can see him, see his back. You see, so all this question of the difficulty to see is really built in the text. And it's not just said, oh, we see and they don't see. You see, it's like, you see.
We don't see either.
Yes, it's a way more complex and tense way of thinking about these questions of identity and religious belonging.
It's interesting to think that the Hebrews weren't as sure of themselves as we are of them. When we're exclusivists or thinking that God revealed himself clearly to them.
Definitely.
That's not so much the case.
It's a way, the Hebrew Bible is holding together things that we have wanted to divide with our modern way of looking.
So what happens if you're a pluralist? Well, how do you read the Bible then?
So if you're a pluralist, you'll probably believe that the Hebrew scripture were just one amongst many writings of the time, which just happened providentially to be passed down quite consistently through the generations. But now let's look at something, at this question a bit differently. What is important to realize, if you want to read the Bible for all its depth and worth, is that it was not written in a day, not by one person, but by a group of persons who shared sometimes the same political views, sometimes not really. And with the division of the kingdoms, you can really see it very clearly. And with the question of exiles, the fact that some of them stayed in the land and others left, just like with any community in the US, you have very different stories if you're in French in the US or in French in France, or if you're an Haitian in Haiti and an Haitian in the US. You're still Haitian, but you're a bit different too. And you bring this difference to your own story, and the text is encapsulating these different voices and stories, although we're still talking about a French product and Asian product, you see, but there are different voices because there has been different embodied human experiences. Yes. So the people who wrote the Hebrew Bible are as diverse as the people who have written American history, for instance. From Puritans to the Founding Fathers, the African American, any community you would like to look at, like Asian American communities, with all their diversity. For all of them, they have enriched it. They have enriched the writing and the telling of the American history with different experiences and viewpoints on the same central culture, faith, idea, be it of the American nation, or if we're talking about the Hebrew Bible, about the God of Israel and what it means to be part of the people of Israel. So I think it's usually helpful to think in terms of like compare to what is your own culture and what are the productions of your own culture, and try to realize that there was not a time where people were pure bubbles separated from the others. That's what we want to read in the past, because we have a very nostalgic and phantasmatic vision of the past as something pure that you can retrieve through historical and devotional work, but has not been the case. Yeah. So let's look at some of the influences that can be felt in the Bible now, and Nigel is going to tell us more about that. Yes, so this was an example of this, like the evolution of American cultural, cultural evolution of America, which is, you still call it America, but it's different, from the Puritans and contemporary America. It's very different, but there's still something that's holding the society together. And that's what the Bible is doing at the level of a book collection, if you want.
What we're going to do very quickly is to see just how interfaith the Bible is. We think, the Bible is, as Joyce has just explained, a homogeneous, clear, single definition of what the Jewish religion is about, what the Hebrew people discovered because God spoke directly to them and had nothing to do with the surrounding cultures, that the surrounding cultures had nothing to do with them either. But let's take, for example, Egypt. See where we're situated here? Here's Jerusalem, right there. On the land bridge between all of these different peoples, across the Arabian desert, up through Mesopotamia. Up here we have the Assyrians, here we have the Babylonians, down here we have the Egyptians, way down here we have the Ethiopians and Cush, here we have the Libyans, up here we have the Hittites, here we have the Cypriots, and here Crete. All of these places, Greece, eventually Rome, all of these places are playing a role in the cultural mishmash that produces the Bible. But we're going to look at one very specific example very quickly, and that's the example of Egypt, down here to the south. Close neighbours to the place where the Bible came to be. Look at this picture, for instance. What you can see here is a picture of Osiris. What does it look like he's sitting on? The waters, the roiling waters. It's the opening of the book of Genesis. What's springing from the waters? Here you have the bird above. Here you have the god of fertility, Osiris, enthroned upon the waters here as the king. So already we're getting some idea of what influences are playing on the formation of the biblical text. They're not inventing this out of nowhere. God isn't sort of beaming it down directly to them and leaving the Egyptians out of the picture, because it looks like the Egyptians have got some of the same ideas as well, coincidentally and strangely, you might say. Here you can see a picture of the cherubim on the left here. This vision of Ezekiel, if you remember, with the winged messenger of God flanked by these wonderful animals. And here on the right, this isn't an Egyptian image, this is an image from Assyria with the winged god of Ashur, the storm god, carrying these flames and bolts of lightning in his hand. We'll see this reappearing in Psalm 18 in a minute. In a very strong way it comes through in that theophanic psalm. Well, here we have Moses. Well, a sort of idealized version of Moses, perhaps. I think he may have worn a few more clothes at the time, but still, by the by. Moses, Acts says that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and by the age of 40, he'd become a powerful leader in speech and in action. Moses' name in Egyptian means is born, like Ra Moses, Ramesses, the god Ra is born. So the greatest hero, visionary, founder of the law and everything else has an Egyptian name, and a very solemn, important name. In him, in one way, the Hebrew nation is born. So the name Moses here overlaps massively with the role that Moses is playing in the Bible. Yahweh, in fact, addresses Moses from the burning bush. You remember this? Just as the supreme god Ra spoke to humanity out of a fire that was burning in a tree, the Ished or the Persea tree. Can you see that on the right-hand side? This, in fact, is not a fountain, it's a tree. It's a sort of tree of life that is communicating itself here to the seated priest on the left-hand side of the picture. Here we can see it again on the left with the Pharaoh here at the heart of the tree, communicating to his people and delivering wisdom. We have a scribe up here on the left-hand side. You can just see his pencil here and his thing, taking down the words that are spoken from the heart of the Ished tree, or the burning Persea tree. Now, in contrast to some other Near Eastern cultures, the ancient Egyptians believed that there was a single creator of the universe. And scholars have noticed parallels between this sort of late developing monotheism in Judah and the cult of the Aten that was introduced by Akhenaten in Egypt. Here he is with his beautiful wife Nefertiti behind him, and here are the sun rays pouring from the one God. Akhenaten believed that the sun was not God, the sun was a manifestation of the power of God. And here at the end of each one of these little hands, there's a little ankh. Can you see the one that is touching the Pharaoh's nose? The symbol of life, this little ankh symbol radiating down from the sun. And he's offering up to this manifestation of God these papyrus reeds and lilies.
What is the ankh symbol exactly?
The ankh symbol simply means life. But it means life in all of its richness, its fullness, its exotic variety, the breath of life itself that's suffused into all things, animal, mineral, vegetal. All things draw life from the radiating heat of the sun.
It's quite close to the cross too.
Yes, it is, isn't it, rather? Yeah. So Psalm 104 and the great hymn to the Aten have got lots of these poetic similes in common, so much so that some people believe that the Egyptians were aware of this hymn to the Aten when the Psalm 104 was composed. So far from being an exclusivist, cut-off culture, we can see that the Bible is already, just on a superficial look at it, very much influenced by the culture of Egypt around it. Here's something else. Circumcision. Do you remember the sign of the covenant? The very important point of Hebrew identity in the Old Testament? Well, it was practiced in Egypt from Neolithic times, from about 10,000 BC. The interesting thing about it, because it came from the Neolithic period, it was always done with a flint knife. Never with a bronze knife, never with an iron knife. When the Bronze Age came about, the Egyptians still circumcised their children with a flint knife. You can see one on the right-hand side here. And even when the Iron Age came about, they still circumcised with a flint knife. Circumcision was completely unknown in the country where Abraham came from, in the northern part of Mesopotamia. So God took this Egyptian custom of circumcision and he honored it as a sign of the Abrahamic covenant with Israel. It was not originally a Hebrew or Semitic practice. It came from Egypt. Moses' own son in the early Iron Age or the late Bronze Age is circumcised with a flint knife in Exodus chapter 4. Not a bronze, but a flint knife. And Joshua in Joshua chapter 5, verses 2 to 3, he's commanded to make flint knives to circumcise the men of Israel who were born while they were wandering through the desert. So as soon as they're on the verge of going into the promised land and they're not circumcised, there's a mass circumcision with flint knives that Joshua makes on purpose. You can see a lovely picture of that on the left. There's a useful bowl here for something. I hope it's got alcohol in it. And here you can see a picture of Egyptian circumcision. See up here? They're holding the hands back. This one is a bit more brave, but he looks as if he's boshing this one on the head. But on the left-hand side here, you can see the end of the hieroglyphs, which say essentially, ouch. And this one who says, hold still, it's nearly over,
Really?
basically. Here's a few other examples of this. The Son of Righteousness shall arise, and Yahweh shall roar out of Zion. This is a biblical image that is influenced by Egyptian iconographic prototypes. You'll find this in Isaiah chapter 31, Jeremiah chapter 25. The Lord will roar from on high, like a lion he has left his den. You can also see it in Joel, the lion has roared, who shall not respond? Does it sound familiar from Egypt? Here's the Sphinx, the great lion of the Pharaoh that roars to protect the Pharaoh's people. So you can see that this image of the roaring lion here, you can see Sekhmet on the right-hand side and Bastet, these two lion-headed gods or goddesses that are used in Egypt. And you can see that this image has also been taken on by the Bible. Also, Psalm 17, Psalm 36, Psalm 57. Hide me in the shadow of your wings. Do you remember this? All people take refuge in the shadow of your wings. Here, but unto all you that fear my name shall the Son of Righteousness arise, risen with healing in his wings. Here we have a slightly American image of that, I think, with the eagle floating along here. But this is not a unique image. In fact, it's a very powerful and very ancient Egyptian image too, of the hovering protective presence of Horus, holding in his claws the Ankh, the sign of life, risen with healing, with life, with vitality in his wings. It's all in ancient Egypt too. The protective wings of the god Horus. And the protective wings that surround, they're often on the top of doors. In ancient Egypt, you would find these wings stretched over to protect the house, to protect the people who walked into the house. Once again, the sign of life here on the bottom. This image is associated with the giving of life and protection. You may recognize this. It's the tomb of Tutankhamun, and here we have the outstretched wings of the gods that are surrounding the sarcophagus, that are protecting the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun. And this protective stretch of wings that you see here around the shrine is found not only in ancient Egypt, but also in the description of the Ark of the Covenant. So when you look at reconstructions of the Ark of the Covenant, there is a striking similarity between the Ark of the Covenant and ancient Egyptian use of this image of the outstretched protective wings. Here is a combination of both images with the name of Yahweh here, with Yahweh depicted both as a lion and as a great hawk, or not sure it quite works, but there it is anyway, standing on the hill of Zion up there. Here's the Ark of the Covenant. Biblical texts say that the Ark of the Covenant, and we can't really imagine anything more Hebrew or Jewish than the Ark of the Covenant, it was a sacred object and it had 5 features to it. It says it was a wooden box and it was overlaid with gold. It had a lid of solid gold with a moulding around its top edge. Here's the moulding. A pair of cherubs or sphinxes on the top of it. Here they are. And wooden poles to carry it. The box itself could only be touched by the priestly tribe of Levi. And then it says that this box contained the tablets of the law. And the box itself, the Ark of the Covenant, served as this symbolic presence of Yahweh. And it was connected to miracles. It was connected to oracles. Moses, Samuel, Saul, David, they all got direct advice from the Ark. Now this has a direct parallel with ancient Egypt. Here's another Ark of the Covenant reconstruction. Here they're not so much protective as about to fly away, I think. But you can see that the same elements are present, this moulding, the box, the pole to carry it, the flying sphinxes over the top. Now, there's a huge parallel here. This is how it was used in the cult. Here's the Holy of Holies, the Ark of the Covenant, and here it's being carried with the trumpeters, with the King David in front of it, with the priests carrying this, with the Ark of Covenant. Here it's shrouded in a sort of cloth. This is the way that it was used in procession in the Bible. Here's a medieval evocation of the same thing. Here's obviously King David with his lyre, the trumpeters, the Ark of the Covenant being carried on poles by the people, entering festively into the city. Here's, I don't know, the Queen or something up top. And here are the sacrifices being made ready for the feast, for the arrival of the Ark of the Covenant into its resting place. So, the Ark of the Covenant and this Egyptian image here of the procession of the god of the shrine. In Egypt, there was a boat. Obviously, Egypt liked these boats, and very often when the shrine here that you can see on the top of it was carried in procession, it was set in this boat which was attached to these poles, which the shaved priests here are carrying in sacred procession. Here you can see the attendants wafting fans. The whole thing was a very solemn business. The interesting thing about this is when the Egyptians took the image of the god out of the shrine in procession, a couple of things happened. It was sometimes taken to the fields in order to produce fertility of the crops or the vines. Secondly, people would line up around it. Do I have a picture of this? Probably not. No. But people would line up around it and ask it questions. Should I start my new business? Will my wife get pregnant this year? Shall I go on a voyage? Will I be healed from my ingrowing toenail? I don't know what. And the priests would respond to these questions by swerving to the right for yes and swerving to the left for no. We know all about this because there are ostraca, little shattered pieces of pottery, which record the verdict of some of these questions that were preserved and kept. When the Ark of the Covenant appeared in public, people addressed these prayers and questions to it for direction. It is also profoundly associated in the Bible with fertility. It's taken to the threshing floor to produce the fertility of the crops. And the grinding of the bread. So the Ark of the Covenant doesn't just sit there in the Holy of Holies and do nothing very much apart from scare people from coming anywhere near it. It's taken out in procession. It's associated with fertility. It's associated with divination, the choice between certain options of right and wrong, of yes and no. I included this slide. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, I have to say. I was going around the temple in Edfu in southern Egypt, and I was busy looking at my little notes. Turned a corner and was looking in the other direction, and I turned round, and here this was right in my face. This was all dark. There was nothing else. I could barely see it. and it loomed out of nowhere and absolutely terrified me. But here you can see the shrine. Normally this shriny bit here would be kept in this little box area at the back, where it was fed and dressed and worshipped and given offerings, just like in the Bible. And when it was taken in procession, it was put on these poles in this little transportable boat affair. So, also the ark is associated with burial. The name of the Ark of the Covenant is Aron, the coffin. And so we can see a similarity between what we just saw in Tutankhamun's tomb and that too. Just very quickly, the Egyptians divided the day and the night into 12 hours each, just like we do, sort of. These days and nights varied according to the season, and each of the hours was ruled by a sort of spirit lord, according to the Egyptians. 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, etc. Each hour had its own spirit lord, and they were all accountable to the one God whom they served as assessors. You would have to pass through each one of them after you died. In the Book of the Dead, there are special spells that that allow you from 1 hour to the other until you get to a place of eternity. In Daniel chapter 7, God is seated on a throne, and he's surrounded by the heavenly thrones, of which, perhaps you'll remember, there are 12. The 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 disciples, and all of the rest of it. So these ancient gods, God had jurisdiction over every hour. He says who can go in it and who can leave it. But in the Bible, suddenly these hours once again appear as the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 disciples. So as we can see from this I'm not sure why I included that. Must be for some reason. As we can see from this brief example, the Hebrews had a very, very complex and subtle relationship with the other faiths that surrounded them. They weren't inclusivist, they weren't exclusivist, they weren't pluralist. They were all of those things at the same time. They were immersed in their culture, and they encountered these other religions as great fertile places of which they themselves were a part. Their story wasn't just beamed down from heaven and invented out of the clouds. It was deeply enfolded in their culture, in their society, in what they ate, in the language that they spoke, in the day-to-day objects that they had in their little apartments and houses. Everything was imbued with this interfaith feeling, as we might call it today. So, also in the New Testament, we can see it very briefly. Here's Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman, a woman of a different faith, though akin to Judaism. Jesus speaks with her at the well. He admires her faith. He tells her to go and preach the good news. What that good news was, when Jesus hadn't been crucified and risen from the dead yet, it's anybody's to guess. Perhaps the good news was that this man had spoken to her and opened them both up to the possibility that God was not an exclusivist that only had something to say to the Jews, but also has something living and dynamic and beautiful to say to the Samaritans too. We can see it also in the story of Paul and the Areopagus. Here he is up on the top of the hill in Athens, preaching to the Greek philosophers, praising them essentially for the fact that they were all worshipping the one creator God. Paul says their only mistake was to have confused God with idols. So let's look now at an interfaith spirituality to conclude. Before we look at some of the prayers that are taken from other traditions, let's remind ourselves of a couple of very important things. First of all, when you encounter the other, whatever other that might be, but I dare say, especially if the other is a person of a different faith that is very different from your own, you're tempted to react either out of fear or out of a desire to dominate that other person. These are two very natural reactions that you might encounter if you come across a Hindu, say, or a Baha'i person or something. We tend to judge before we understand. And a fatal thing that we do is that we compare the best in our own faith tradition with the worst in the faith traditions of our neighbours. One day I was talking to this rather proper lady from the south of England in a nice Laura Ashley dress. And I told her what I was doing. I was studying Islam. It was at a Christian retreat centre. And her face fell, and she said, yes, Islam. You know, Muslim men beat their wives as a religious principle. And I said, well, where's your information from? And she said, well, it's in the Quran. And I said, have you read the Quran? And she said, no, it's a demonic book. And I said, but you've probably read the Bible, and you might actually remember the 9th commandment about bearing false witness against your neighbour. The Quran says that beating your wife is haram. Here are some verses, not only from Al-Bukhari, here on the left, but from the Quran itself. He created for you mates from among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them, and he has put love and mercy between your hearts. The Bible does not say that it is permitted to beat your wife. Who says it? Have a look. If you love your wife, you'll discipline her. A husband is not loving his wife as Christ loves his church if he does not rebuke and discipline his wife. And on the left here, we have a little Christian novel, Alpha Husbands and Obedient Wives. This is a Christian domestic discipline romance, which means there's a lot of spanking in it, I understand. I've never read one of these things, but you can bet that...
Be careful, your birthday is coming soon.
Oh dear, 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 dear. So you see, don't judge. And if you're going to compare like with like. Those are the 2 golden rules of an interfaith spirituality. Don't go in there to judge. And compare like with like. If you want to compare extremist Muslims with moderate Christians, you're not being fair. That's not what you do. You compare extremist Muslims with extremist Christians on whatever subject you care to admit. The first discipline of interfaith spirituality is therefore humility. Don't judge. Don't think better of yourself than you ought to think. And engaging in an interfaith spirituality involves that deeply Christian commitment to humility and openness. Now, any interfaith spirituality is going to lead you into a deeper understanding of your own tradition. Firstly, if you come across something that you don't like in the tradition of somebody else, think about whether there's something similar in your own faith. For instance, I can't say that I'm a Christian without remembering that these people said they were Christians too, the Crusaders, who boasted that the streets of Jerusalem were flowing up to the horses' hocks in Muslim blood, and Christian blood, incidentally. They didn't make much of a distinction when it came to Eastern Orthodox Christians. Or think of these people, the Spanish Inquisition. These people are my fellow believers if I call myself a Christian. So before I turn round and say, look what the Muslims are doing, they're Muslims, I have to say, these people are Christians. These people were of the same faith as I. My faith has this potential in it. And if I don't admit that, I cannot engage in an interfaith spirituality, because I will be judging and I will not be comparing like with like. Secondly, if you come across something that you like in the religious practice of another person, don't confuse liking something with understanding it. There might be something, there might be much more to what you have just seen than meets the eye. Take, for example, the martyrdom of Hussein in Shiite Islam. There's lots of beautiful poetry associated with the commemoration of Muharram, the martyrdom of Hussein. Here on the right, there's a beautiful image of this martyrdom. When you look at it at first, you think, what on earth is that? It looks really spooky and dangerous and terroristic. but actually what it's talking about here is that the martyrdom of Hussein is actually a great statement against terrorism. Hussein was killed and hacked to pieces by what the Shiite Muslims consider to be terrorists. However, sometimes the martyrdom Hussein in those great processions at Muharram have driven people to a state of anti-Semitic violence, for instance. There's more to what you see than meets the eye. Think for a minute about the ways that the things you've considered beautiful in your own faith have been used for purposes that are far removed from the beautiful. Think of the great address that the Archbishop of Paris made from Notre Dame, urging people on to the Crusades. So when a Muslim person sees some of those places that have been the center of that sort of extremism, they may not see them in the same way as you do. An encounter with other religions than my own is going to bring me to a place where I see my own faith as if for the first time. That's one of the most beautiful things about an interfaith spirituality. Two ways in which an interfaith spirituality can be explored. First of all, the celebration of diversity. Whether you're an exclusivist or a pluralist or whatever you are, you'll encounter a neighbor of a different faith at some point. We all do. It's uncharitable, it's unkind to ignore the faith of your neighbor altogether, especially when it's a sort of crucial and central part of your neighbor's identity. And you can begin when you encounter a person of another faith, not by sort of declaring what you believe straight away and sort of turning the thing into a exclusivist, inclusivist, pluralist encounter, but you can begin by asking a few questions. Tell me something about your practices. How do you observe your feast days? Do you buy new clothes? Is there any dancing involved? What role do children play in Eid, for instance? That people love to talk about their children if they have them. They love to talk about clothes. They love to talk about dancing. What do you eat? Do you go to the temple or the synagogue or the Gurdwara? And these produce wonderful, interesting, fascinating conversations that are all to do with faith. They're not cultural questions, because as we've just seen, your culture and your faith are profoundly and deeply intertwined with each other, and that goes for the Bible as well. The other question, the other thing that you can do actually in this realm, here's an example of it. This is United Religions Initiative. This is the Mid-Hudson Valley, so it's just up the road from us. What can we do together? Other faiths have very similar political and environmental and social aspirations as our own. From Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, environmental activism, this multiplicity of faith traditions has led them to a much greater understanding of each other, working on all of these projects together. What other people's spiritual traditions and practices are around the environment. What's their equivalent, say, of a harvest festival? Do they have one? What time of year does it take place? How can we look through another person's eyes to explore all of these matters in our own faith tradition and in the faith traditions of others? Here's a couple of practical exercises to finish with. First of all, how would you explain your faith to a person who was of another faith, or from no faith at all? If you have been brought up in some evangelical tradition, you have probably been taught in some way how to give your testimony, how you gave your life to Jesus. And sometimes that can come over in rather an exclusivist fashion. Before I was a wretched sinner and Jesus came into my life and now I'm saved and I'm so different from everybody else and I would like you to share the same joy. But let's just leave that out for a second. Of course, that's a way of telling your story. But one of the things that perhaps is a good spiritual practice here is to ask yourselves these questions. would you do it primarily through words or through actions? Think about how you came to faith yourself and how that related to your own cultural background. Think about how your faith might have made a difference in your life. And then allow that to shape your story, how you'll tell the story of your faith from the inside. The second thing that you might do, and this is quite a useful practice whether or not you want to tell your story to anybody else, is to do something like this. Look back on your life and think of it in terms of phases. When you moved from one place to another, when you got a different job, when you went through one relationship to another relationship, when you moved to school, when you left home. Just try and divide it into phases of your life. And for each phase, choose a person, a teacher or a parent or somebody you met, a relationship you had. Choose a place that was particularly significant for that phase of your life. A piece of music that you remember from it. A book or a piece of literature that you were reading or interested in at the time. And perhaps a work of art that meant something to you at that period. Now set them out in the form of a grid or a sort of little plot and see if you can see a story that's developing as you look at the shape that your life has taken. Then try and give a narrative of your faith given the framework of these phases of your life. And you will notice that it becomes so much more incarnational, so more enculturated, but so much imbued with the movement of the Spirit through each of these phases of your spiritual progress and your personal progress too. This is a really useful way of preparing to tell your story to a person of another faith, because you will be honest about what sort of role your own cultural background has played in this. And it won't become a dogmatic story of Jesus saving you. That might still be there. I hope that's still there. But it will be enclothed, incarnated, enmeshed in your life experience in quite a beautiful and moving way. The other thing that one might do is find some prayers of people of other faiths that appeal to you. The interesting thing about this is that you've got some right in your own home. You don't have to look very far. The Psalms are a beautiful expression of spirituality that is not our own spirituality. This was the Jewish people's spirituality, still is. And you might encounter descriptions of God in the Psalms that you initially find quite shocking. Here's something from Psalm 18. Here is how it's depicted in the book of Ezekiel. Of course, we see that as God riding on the cherubim and everything. But Psalm 18 says, smoke rose from his nostrils and consuming fire came from his mouth. Burning coals blazed out of his mouth. He parted the heavens and he came down, and dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted upon the cherubim and flew, and he soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering and his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. This sounds like something from Assyria. It doesn't sound something like something from the Bible, let alone a God with flaming coals pouring out of his mouth and smoke coming out of his nose. This is not a sort of image of God that we tend to be familiar with or find helpful. And certainly Ezekiel has not got flaming coals coming out of God's mouth or smoke coming out of his nose either. In fact, it's quite an accessible image here, and therefore not terribly biblical when it comes to this. Here's a lovely Jewish prayer to pray on waking, and this is particularly loved by children. I give thanks before you, King, living and eternal, for you have returned within me my soul with compassion. Abundant is your faithfulness. A short little prayer to use on waking up for a few days that comes from the Jewish tradition. There are also a beautiful prayer here that can be prayed after a troubling dream. Can we think of any prayers from the Christian tradition that you might pray if you've had a nightmare? Well, here's one from the Jewish tradition that you might want to try. Master of the universe, I am yours, and my dreams are yours. I have dreamed a dream, and I do not know what it is. Whether I have dreamed of myself, whether my friends have dreamed of me, or whether I have dreamed of others, if the dreams are good, strengthen them and reinforce them like the dreams of Joseph. And if the dreams require healing, heal them like the bitter waters of Mara by Moses, our teacher, and like Miriam from her leprosy, and like Hezekiah from his illness. And like Hezekiah from his illness, and like the bitter waters of Jericho by Elisha. And just as you transformed the curse of Balaam the wicked into a blessing, so transform all of my dreams for me for the best. It's a lovely prayer, and one that is missing, as far as I know, from the Christian tradition. It may be there in the Fathers. We might have a look at that at some point. But
it's not in the BCP.
It's not in the BCP, no. Here's a couple of Islamic prayers that are rather good. This one is grace before a meal. In the name of God, the most merciful, the beneficent, O nourisher and provider of all things, we offer our thanks and gratitude for this food and for those who prepared it. In a world where so many are hungry, may we eat this food with humble hearts. We offer our thanks and gratitude for each member of our community and the opportunity that we all have to come together to do good. Dear God, may you bless our efforts and help us sit present with one another, mindful of our purpose. In the name of God and with the blessings of God, let us begin. This is an old prayer. This isn't something that was invented a couple of days ago by some imam at some civic occasion. It's an old and rather beautiful prayer of blessing that can be used in a heartfelt way by Christians. There's also a prayer for light from the Islamic tradition, which sounds rather like the prayers for light from the Celtic tradition. Give me light in my heart, and light in my tongue, and light in my hearing, and light in my sight, light in my feeling, light in all my body, light before me and light behind me. Give me, I pray thee, light on my right hand, and light on my left hand, and light above me and light beneath me. O Lord, increase light within me, and give me light, and illuminate me. So you see, there's a great richness in the traditions of prayer of other faiths that Christians can pray too. As we saw, that the Hebrews were quite happy to use a psalm, possibly from ancient Egypt, or a few Assyrian bits and bobs that they threw into the mix. Here is a Hindu mantra. You don't have to do it in Sanskrit. The mantra can be repeated and repeated and repeated. From unreal, lead me to real. From darkness, lead me to light. From death, lead me to transcend it. That can be read in a very Christian way, and also in a deeply Hindu way, and in many other religious tradition ways as well. So, what I'm going to do before I ask if there's any questions is to conclude with a prayer. And this is a prayer of an 8th century Muslim mystic, a woman by the name of Rabia. It's a very famous prayer. Let us pray. O God, if I worship thee in fear of hell, burn me in hell. And if I worship thee in hope of paradise, exclude me from paradise. But if I worship thee for thine own sake, withhold not thine everlasting beauty. That sums up, to me, the spirituality of interfaith. So much of our religious pursuit comes from fear of condemnation, of hell, of exclusion, whatever faith that we belong to. So much of it is desire for paradise, enlightenment, and entry into some great mystery. And yet, our pursuit in the end is a pursuit of the beauty of God. And that should be the prime motivator of all our spiritualities. And when we recognize that in the spirituality of the other, then we have something to learn from each other, something to say to each other, and the possibility of a world that is free from religious violence and misunderstanding.